For 4,000 years, one paragraph in the Bible has caused more damage than almost any other paragraph ever written. It has been used to justify slavery. It has been used to condemn entire continents. It has been quoted by kings, by popes, by plantation owners, by hate groups, and by preachers in the American South standing in front of congregations of white farmers who owned other human beings. And to this day, no one agrees on what it actually means. The paragraph is in Genesis chapter 9, 12 verses, and they describe something that happened one night inside a tent. Noah, the man who saved humanity from the flood, is drunk and naked on the floor. His son Ham walks in. Something happens, and when Noah wakes up, he does not curse the son who was in the tent with him. He curses that son's son, a grandson who was not even there. Why? 2,000 years of rabbis, priests, historians, and scholars have tried to answer that question, and they have come up with theories that range from the innocent to the horrifying: voyeurism, mockery, theft, castration, sexual assault, incest. The theories all agree on one thing: something serious happened in that tent. Something much worse than what the surface of the text lets you see on a first reading. And whatever it was, it left a mark on human history that we are still living with today. This is the secret sin of Ham, and this is what the passage might actually mean. To understand what happens inside Noah's tent, you have to understand what has just happened to the entire planet. Because the story we are about to look at does not take place in a normal world. It takes place in the strangest, quietest, emptiest world in the entire Bible. A world with only 8 human beings in it. The flood is over. The water has drained. Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives have stepped off the ark onto a mountain. Every other human being on earth is dead. Every civilization that existed before the flood has been washed away. Every city, every farm, every road, every temple, every language, everything. There are 8 people, and there are the animals from the ark, and there is a planet that has just been scrubbed clean. Noah is the patriarch of this new world. Not just the patriarch of a family, the patriarch of the entire human species. Every person alive today, if you believe the biblical account, is descended from him. From him and from the 3 sons who walked off that ark. The 3 sons are named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, including the Hebrews, the Assyrians, the Aramaeans, and eventually the Arabs. Japheth is the ancestor of the Indo-European peoples, spreading north and west into what would eventually become Europe and parts of Central Asia. And Ham is the ancestor of the peoples who will populate Africa, the Levant, and the Near East. Egypt, Cush, Put, and Canaan. Every dark chapter, every empire, every genocide, every civilization that shows up in the Old Testament traces back to one of these 3 brothers. And on the day the story begins, they are just a family. 4 couples in tents on a hillside, trying to figure out how to farm a planet that has just been drowned. Noah plants a vineyard. This is the first agricultural act described after the flood, and it tells us something interesting about him. Because a vineyard is not a survival crop, you do not plant grapes if you are worried about starving. You plant grain, you plant beans. You plant something that will feed you next season. A vineyard takes years to mature. It is a long-term investment. It is a symbol of confidence, of settling in, of believing that the world is stable enough to grow something for pleasure. And Noah, after the flood, plants a vineyard, and in time the grapes come in, and he makes wine, and he drinks it. And here is where the story starts to turn strange. Because the text says Noah drank the wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered inside his tent. This is the first time drunkenness is described in the entire Bible. Noah is the first drunk man in Scripture. And nothing in the flood account has prepared us for this. This is the same Noah who was called a righteous man, who walked with God, who was described in Genesis 6 as blameless in his generation. The most faithful human being on earth, the man God chose to save from a genocidal flood, is now sprawled naked and unconscious on the floor of his tent. Some early Christian commentators noticed a strange parallel here that most readers miss. Because Noah, in the biblical framing, is the second Adam. The first Adam was placed in a garden, given dominion, told to be fruitful and multiply, and given one prohibition. He failed. He ate the fruit, and he became naked in his garden, ashamed, and hiding from God. Noah is placed on a cleaned earth, given dominion in the covenant of chapter 9, told to be fruitful and multiply, and given essentially a fresh start. And within one chapter, he too eats the fruit of a plant, becomes drunk, and lies naked and ashamed inside a tent. The parallel is deliberate. Genesis is not just telling you what Noah did. Genesis is telling you that the second Adam, the fresh start humanity was supposed to have, failed just like the first Adam. The problem of humanity was not solved by the flood. It was only postponed, and it showed up again in a vineyard, in a tent, on the floor, in a man who had once walked with God. That is the theological background of this scene, and that is why what happens next is so devastating, because it is not just a story about one family. It is a story about the impossibility of clean starts, about how quickly the new world becomes the old one, and the son who is about to walk into that tent is not just the son of Noah. In the biblical framing, he is the second Cain, the son who exposes the failure of the father instead of covering it. Some scholars have suggested that Noah might not have understood how strong wine could be, that the pre-flood atmosphere was different, and grapes fermented differently, and this was the first time humans had encountered alcohol at this strength. Others say he understood exactly what he was doing, and this is the first sign that even the man God saved was, in the end, still just a man. Whatever the reason, Noah is passed out, he is exposed, and he is alone. Picture the scene for a moment, because everything about it matters. It is night. The tent is small, the wineskins are empty, or nearly so, on the floor beside him. Outside, the world is still recovering. There are no cities, there are no neighbors, there is only the vineyard, and the animals from the ark grazing somewhere below the hill, and the wind moving through a landscape that has only recently been drained of a global ocean. The stars overhead are the same stars that once looked down on the pre-flood world. They are the only witnesses that survived. And under those stars, a man who was once described by God as the only righteous person on earth is lying face down on a rug, unconscious, uncovered, and completely defenseless. This is the moment Ham chooses to walk in. Then Ham walks in. The text describes what happens next in a way that has driven scholars insane for 2,000 years, because it says almost nothing and yet somehow says everything. It says, "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside." Read that sentence 3 times, because everything about what follows depends on what those words mean. Ham saw. Ham told. 2 verbs. That is the entire description of what Ham did. But Noah's reaction when he wakes up is not the reaction of a father whose son saw him accidentally and told the family about it. Noah's reaction is fury. Noah's reaction is the words of a man who knows something terrible has been done to him. Because the text goes on, when the brothers, Shem and Japheth, hear what Ham has told them, they do something strange. They take a garment, they lay it on both their shoulders, they walk backward into the tent, they cover their father without looking, then they back out again, still without looking, And when Noah wakes up from his wine, the text says, he knew what his younger son had done to him. Knew, not guessed, not suspected, knew. And then Noah opens his mouth, and what comes out is not what any reader expects. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Canaan, not Ham. Canaan, Ham's son, who was probably not even present. Noah curses the grandson. Then Noah continues, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. 3 times. Noah says the curse 3 times. Canaan will be a servant. Canaan will be a servant. Canaan will be a servant. And then the passage ends. The text does not explain. The text does not moralize. It just moves on. And the reader is left with a puzzle so strange, so unresolved, that Jewish and Christian scholars have been fighting about it since the beginning, because everything about the story does not add up. If Ham simply saw his father naked, why is the punishment so extreme? If the sin was just gossip, why does Noah curse a grandchild? If Shem and Japheth did not see anything, why does the text emphasize their backwards walk so carefully? What are they protecting themselves from? What is under that garment that they cannot look at? The Hebrew phrase that gets translated as saw the nakedness of his father is where the entire puzzle starts. Because in Hebrew, that phrase does not always mean what it looks like it means. In other places in the Old Testament, the phrase to uncover the nakedness of somebody is used specifically for sexual acts. In Leviticus chapter 18, it appears over and over as the technical language for prohibited sexual relationships. To uncover your father's nakedness means, in Leviticus, to have sex with your father's wife. To uncover your mother's nakedness means to have sex with your mother. It is a legal, technical, and unmistakable idiom for sexual violation. And that same phrase, or something very close to it, is what gets used to describe what Ham did. So the question that has haunted this passage for 2,000 years is not what the text says. The question is what the text is hiding. And this is where the theories begin. The first theory, and the one most people who grew up in Sunday school were taught, is that what Ham did was simple voyeurism and mockery. In this reading, Ham walked into the tent, saw his father drunk and naked, thought it was funny or shameful, and ran outside to tell his brothers about it. He did not just accidentally see. He looked, he stared, he probably laughed, and then he broadcast his father's shame to the rest of the family, hoping to humiliate the patriarch. In the ancient world, this kind of public humiliation was a serious crime. To expose your father's shame was to attack his authority. In a small family group, in a post-flood world where Noah was the only surviving human patriarch, this was not just rude, it was a coup. It was Ham using his father's moment of weakness to try to take his position in the family hierarchy. And when Shem and Japheth walked backwards into the tent to cover him, they were rejecting Ham's coup. They were saying, "We will not participate in the dishonoring of our father. We will not even look." This theory has the advantage of matching the surface of the text. Ham saw. Ham told. Noah cursed. It also fits the ancient Near Eastern concept of shame, which was communal. Your shame was your family's shame. To expose it was an act of aggression. But this theory has a problem. And it is a very large problem. The problem is Canaan. If Ham committed the sin of voyeurism and mockery, why is Canaan the one who gets cursed? Canaan was not in the tent. Canaan is Ham's 4th son, according to Genesis chapter 10. And in this reading, Canaan has done nothing. He is punished for something his father did, and even that punishment does not fall on the other sons of Ham, only on him. For the voyeurism theory to hold, you have to accept that Noah's curse was somehow prophetic, that God worked through him to declare a future for a specific branch of the family that had not yet done anything wrong. Some scholars accept this. Others find it deeply unsatisfying, because everywhere else in the Bible where a punishment is prophesied against a group, there is usually a reason attached. Here, there is no reason. There is only the curse. So a second theory emerged, and this one is much older and much darker, and it comes from ancient Jewish tradition. The second theory says that Ham did not just look. Ham castrated Noah. This theory shows up in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin. Rabbi Berechiah, quoted in the passage, argues that Ham did something to Noah that permanently prevented him from having any more children. The reasoning is grim. The rabbis observed something curious in the text. Noah has 3 sons. Only 3. In a post-flood world with an obligation to be fruitful and multiply, you would expect the patriarch of the entire human species to have many more children. But he does not. The text never mentions any more sons. Noah lives for another 350 years after the flood, and there is no record of any additional children. Why? The rabbinic answer is that Ham made sure there could not be any, that Ham, wanting to eliminate any future competition for the inheritance of the earth, castrated his father while he was passed out drunk. That is why Noah, when he wakes up, knows exactly what has been done to him, because he can feel it. His body has been mutilated. His future has been surgically removed. Rashi, the greatest of the medieval Jewish commentators, writing in 11th century France, actually preserved this reading in his commentary on Genesis. Rashi cites the tradition that Ham either castrated Noah or committed the sin against him described in the maternal incest reading. Rashi does not pick between the two. He records both as legitimate readings of what happened, both preserved in the Talmudic tradition, both possible answers to the question the text refuses to answer. When you find both interpretations sitting side by side in the most authoritative Jewish commentary on the Torah, you are looking at how seriously the rabbinic tradition took the darkness of what Ham did. They did not settle for the surface reading. They looked underneath, and what they saw was bad enough that they preserved 2 separate versions of it. This theory explains several things at once. It explains why Noah's reaction is fury rather than mere embarrassment. It explains why Noah has no more children. It explains why Ham's action is called something his son did to him, which is stronger language than mere looking would justify. And it explains, in a strange way, why Canaan gets cursed. Because Canaan, in this reading, is Ham's 4th son. Noah, in cursing Canaan, may be cursing the son of Ham, who corresponds to the son Noah himself could no longer have. It is a symbolic parallel. Ham stole Noah's 4th son by preventing him from being born, so Noah takes Ham's 4th son by cursing him into slavery. The castration theory has ancient roots. It was written down in Jewish sources within a few hundred years of Christ, and it may reflect a much older oral tradition. But it also has problems. The text itself never mentions any bodily injury. It uses the phrase, saw the nakedness of his father, not took away the manhood of his father. And most modern scholars find the theory too speculative, too dependent on filling in gaps that the text leaves silent. So we come to the third theory, and this one is, for many readers, the most disturbing of all, because it involves not just Noah, it involves Noah's wife. The third theory is that Ham committed maternal incest, that he had sex with his own mother, and that Canaan is the result. This theory is grounded in that same passage from Leviticus we mentioned earlier. In Leviticus chapter 18, verses 7 and 8, the law lists forbidden sexual relationships. And it says, The nakedness of your father, that is the nakedness of your mother, you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. In other words, in ancient Hebrew legal language, to uncover the nakedness of your father was a specific and technical way of saying to sleep with your father's wife. The two nakednesses were considered one because in marriage, husband and wife were one flesh. To violate the wife was to violate the husband. If this reading is correct, then what happened in the tent was not that Ham saw Noah naked. What happened is that Ham, finding his father passed out drunk, went to his mother, or found his mother, and had sex with her. In the language of the ancient world, this was called uncovering the father's nakedness. And Noah, when he wakes up, understands what has happened. He does not curse Ham directly, because the punishment falls where the offense produced fruit. And the fruit of the offense is Canaan. In this reading, Canaan is not just Ham's youngest son. Canaan is the child produced by the assault, which is why Canaan, and only Canaan, is cursed. Because Canaan is the only son of Ham whose very existence is a monument to what Ham did in that tent. This theory has a lot going for it linguistically. It explains the Leviticus parallel, which is otherwise strangely coincidental. It explains why the punishment falls on Canaan and not on Ham's other sons. It explains why Shem and Japheth's careful backwards walk matters, because they are protecting themselves from any accusation that they might have participated in what happened. And it explains, in the darkest possible way, why Noah's reaction is so severe. There is another detail that supports this reading, and most readers of Genesis never notice it. It is a structural parallel that appears later in the same book. And once you see it, the story of Noah's tent begins to look like a pattern that Genesis is deliberately setting up. The parallel is the story of Lot and his daughters, told in Genesis chapter 19. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, has just escaped the destruction of Sodom. His wife has been killed. He is living in a cave with his two daughters. His daughters, believing that no one else in the world will marry them, make a plan. They get their father drunk on wine. Then, on 2 consecutive nights, they each go into his tent and sleep with him while he is unconscious. Both daughters become pregnant, and the sons who are born of that incident become the ancestors of 2 nations, Moab and Ammon, both of which, for the rest of the Old Testament, are among Israel's most persistent enemies. Look at the parallel: a patriarch, drunk on wine, in a tent, an act of sexual violation while he is unconscious, and the offspring produced by that violation becomes a cursed nation that troubles Israel for centuries. The story of Lot and his daughters looks, in every structural element, like an echo of the story of Noah and Ham. Genesis is doing something on purpose here. It is showing us that this is a pattern in the pre-Israel world, a specific pattern of sexual sin around a drunk patriarch, and it is producing, in both cases, a nation that will haunt Israel later. If Genesis was not signaling that this is what happened with Ham, then the parallel with Lot's daughters is one of the strangest accidents in ancient literature. But if Genesis was signaling it, then the maternal incest theory of Ham is not a stretch. It is a reading that the author of Genesis wanted you to reach when you compared the 2 stories. And the fact that most modern readers never notice the parallel says more about the discomfort of the topic than about the clarity of the text. But this theory has a difficulty too. The text says Noah knew what his younger son had done to him, not to his wife. Some scholars argue that in ancient patriarchal thought, an offense against a man's wife was an offense against the man himself. Others argue that the phrase "to him" would not be used if the actual victim was Noah's wife. The Hebrew grammar allows both readings, and scholars have argued about it for centuries. But maternal incest is not the only sexual theory. There is a fourth theory, and this one is even darker. The fourth theory says that what Ham did to Noah was not through his mother, it was directly to Noah himself. Some scholars, reading the phrase "saw the nakedness of his father" in the strictest sexual sense, argue that Ham sexually assaulted his own unconscious father. In this reading, Noah's drunkenness left him unable to defend himself. Ham took advantage of that, and when Noah woke up, he knew physically what had been done to his body. This reading is rare in modern commentary because it is so severe, but it does show up in some scholarly literature. It fits the strongest possible reading of the Hebrew idiom, and it explains why the crime is called something Ham did to Noah, not something Ham saw or heard. In this reading, what Ham did was an act of violation, an assertion of dominance, an ancient act of male-on-male sexual aggression that in the ancient Near East would have symbolized a takeover of the father's household and authority. The problem with this reading is the same problem as the castration theory. The text does not explicitly say it. The reader has to fill in a great deal of the story from silence. And most modern scholars, even those who accept the maternal incest reading, do not accept the paternal assault reading. They see it as reading too much into a text that is deliberately quiet. And then there is a fifth theory, and this one is the strangest of all. This theory comes from an ancient Jewish tradition, preserved in various midrashic sources, that says the sin of Ham was theft. Specifically, the theft of a garment. In this tradition, Noah possessed a special robe, a garment that had been passed down from Adam himself, or given to Noah directly by God. It was a priestly garment, a symbol of religious authority. It was the badge of office that made Noah the priest and patriarch of the entire post-flood world. And when Noah was passed out drunk in his tent, Ham crept in and stole it. The garment then, in this tradition, ended up being inherited by Ham's grandson Nimrod, who used it to become the first king and hunter of the ancient world. Nimrod is the one who, in Jewish tradition, builds the Tower of Babel. He is described in Genesis chapter 10 as a mighty hunter before the Lord, and the tradition says that his power came from the garment stolen from Noah's tent. This theory has a certain elegance. It explains why the sin is symbolic and religious rather than physical. It ties the story of Ham to the story of Nimrod, which is otherwise disconnected. And it fits the ancient world's understanding that clothing and identity were connected. To steal a priest's garment was to steal his office. In an ancient sense, Ham was not just stealing a piece of cloth, he was stealing the priesthood. But this theory, like the others, has to fill in a lot from silence. The text mentions no garment. It only mentions Noah's nakedness, and most modern scholars treat the garment tradition as a later legend, developed by rabbis to make sense of a passage that otherwise makes no sense. So we have 5 theories: voyeurism and mockery, castration, maternal incest, paternal sexual assault, and theft of the priestly garment. Any of these could be what happened. All of them have supporters. None of them can be proven from the text alone, and every one of them raises the same question. Why does Noah curse Canaan? Canaan is not in the tent. Canaan, at the time of the incident, might be a small child, or might not even be born yet, depending on how you read the chronology. But Noah, waking up, does not curse Ham. He curses Canaan, and this is where all the theories have to converge, because none of them work unless they can explain the shifted target of the curse. The voyeurism theory says the curse is prophetic. Noah, filled with the Spirit, sees the future of Ham's line and knows that the branch through Canaan will be the branch most opposed to God. This is a defensible reading, but it feels like a workaround. It requires you to accept that Noah, angry at Ham, chose to pick out one of Ham's 4 sons and prophetically damn him, while the other 3, Cush, Mizraim and Put, would go on to found nations that were not cursed at all. The castration theory says the curse on Canaan is symbolic. Ham took Noah's future son by preventing his birth. Noah takes Ham's future by cursing his fourth son. It is a form of grim reciprocity. The maternal incest theory says the curse is targeted at the actual product of the sin. Canaan is the child that resulted from Ham's assault on his mother. He is the walking evidence of what happened, and Noah, unable to punish Ham directly for reasons the text does not explain, punishes the one who was born of the offense. The paternal assault theory says the curse falls on Canaan because Canaan is the son who most represents Ham's future. Cursing him is cursing Ham's inheritance. The theft theory says Canaan inherits the guilt of the stolen garment because Canaan is the branch of Ham's line that will most directly benefit from what Ham took. Nimrod comes from Cush, but the land promised to Abraham later, the land of Canaan itself, is the location where the stolen priesthood will play out. All 5 theories can explain the curse on Canaan, but none of them prove which sin actually happened. And this ambiguity is where the story starts to bleed into the rest of history, because whatever Ham did that night, the consequences of it did not stop with him. They ran through his descendants for 4,000 years. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the interpretation of this passage did not stay in the world of ancient rabbis. It became, in the medieval and early modern periods, one of the most weaponized passages in the entire Bible. To understand what happened, you need to know what Genesis chapter 10 does. Immediately after the story of Noah's tent, Genesis gives us what scholars call the Table of Nations. It is a genealogical map. It lists every people group that descends from Noah's 3 sons, and it is remarkably detailed for an ancient document. From Ham come Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And these become the ancestors of, according to the text, the peoples of the Nile Valley, the peoples of the Horn of Africa, the peoples of North Africa, and the peoples of what would become the land of Israel before the Hebrew conquest. In other words, in the biblical account, Ham is the ancestor of Africa and much of the Near East. For most of biblical history, no one thought much about the racial implications of this. The Table of Nations was read as a description of geographic and linguistic dispersion. Ham's descendants included the Egyptians, who built the greatest civilization of the ancient world. They included the Canaanites, who were later conquered by Joshua. They included the Cushites, whose kingdom in what is now Sudan traded with Solomon. But somewhere between the 6th and the 10th centuries after Christ, something started to change. Certain rabbinic sources began to describe Ham as being cursed with dark skin. The Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin at page 108, contains a passage that says Ham was smitten in his skin. Some medieval commentators interpreted this to mean that Ham's descendants were darker in complexion, and then some Islamic sources, drawing on Jewish material, added their own extensions. And then Christian sources, drawing on both, added more. By the medieval period, a theological tradition was developing in some circles that read the curse on Canaan as a curse on all of Ham's descendants, and specifically identified Ham's descendants with the peoples of Africa. This reading was not universal. It was not accepted by many rabbis or theologians, but it existed, and it was preserved. And then, in the age of European expansion, in the age of the transatlantic slave trade, this reading was picked up and weaponized. For roughly 4 centuries, from the 1600s through the 1800s, Christian slaveholders in Europe and in the American South used this passage as their primary theological justification for the enslavement of Africans. Sermons were preached from Genesis chapter 9. Slave owners quoted the curse on Canaan and applied it to entire continents. Preachers in the antebellum South argued that the descendants of Ham were destined by God to serve the descendants of Shem and Japheth, that the curse Noah pronounced in his tent was still in effect, that slavery was not a violation of biblical morality, it was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. Some of the specific names attached to this theology are still on record. Josiah Priest, in a book published in 1843 titled Bible Defense of Slavery, argued extensively from Genesis 9 that Africans were the descendants of Ham and that their servitude was divinely mandated. His book went through multiple editions and was widely distributed across the slaveholding South. Frederick Dalcho, a South Carolina minister, wrote a work in 1823 titled Practical Considerations Founded on the Scriptures Relative to the Slave Population of South Carolina, in which he argued that the enslavement of Africans was consistent with divine order because of the curse on Ham. Thornton Stringfellow, a Baptist minister from Virginia, published a widely read defense of slavery from Scripture that leaned heavily on this reading. Robert Louis Dabney, the influential Southern Presbyterian theologian and chaplain to Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War, continued to argue for a hierarchical racial order based on the sons of Noah even after the war was over. These were not fringe voices. These were mainstream Southern Christian scholars, teachers, and clergy. They shaped what tens of thousands of pastors preached from their pulpits. Their books were sold in every major bookstore of the American South. Their arguments were read into the record of state legislatures. And their central biblical text, more than any other, was Genesis 9, verses 20 through 27. The 12 verses about a night in a tent. Every part of this reading is textually wrong. Noah did not curse Ham. He cursed Canaan. Ham had 4 sons, and only Canaan was named in the curse. The Canaanites were the inhabitants of the land Israel would later conquer, and the biblical text traces their story specifically. They were not the peoples of Africa. Cush, Mizraim, and Put, the sons of Ham, who did become the ancestors of African peoples, were not cursed at all. Nowhere in the Bible is dark skin ever named as a curse. The tradition that reads Ham himself as dark-skinned appears only in later commentary, not in the biblical text. Look at what the Bible actually says about the other sons of Ham. Cush is the ancestor of the Cushites, whose kingdom in what is now northern Sudan and southern Egypt was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon and marveled at his wisdom, is traditionally understood in some accounts to have come from a Cushite background. A Cushite eunuch, described in the Book of Acts as a treasurer for the Queen of Ethiopia, is one of the first Gentile converts to Christianity, baptized by Philip on a desert road. Cush is not cursed anywhere in Scripture. Cush is honored. Mizraim is the ancestor of the Egyptians, who built one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. Egypt, in the biblical account, is the place that shelters Joseph, that shelters the family of Jacob in the famine, that later becomes the setting of the entire Exodus story. Even in judgment against Egypt, the prophets speak of a future in which Egypt is called God's people, along with Assyria as the work of God's hands and Israel as God's inheritance. The book of Isaiah, in chapter 19, verse 25, contains one of the most surprising blessings in the entire Old Testament, spoken over the Egyptians, the descendants of Mizraim, the son of Ham. Put is the ancestor of the Libyans, another North African people. Nowhere is Put cursed. Nowhere is Put's line consigned to servitude by anyone speaking for God. The curse Noah spoke was on Canaan, on one son, on one branch of one family, on the people who would inhabit one specific piece of land west of the Jordan River. To extend that curse to Cush, to Mizraim, to Put, and through them to every dark-skinned person on the continent of Africa is not a reading of the text. It is a construction imposed on the text by people who had already decided what they wanted the text to mean. And the fulfillment of the curse on Canaan is described in the book of Joshua, where the Canaanites are conquered and subjugated by the Israelites. That is where the biblical narrative closes the loop. The curse in Genesis 9 is answered in the conquest narrative centuries later. There is no textual bridge from that ancient conquest to the enslavement of Africans in the 16th century. That bridge was built by slaveholders who needed a theology to justify what they were doing, and they built it out of a distortion of one paragraph in Genesis. The Southern Baptist Convention, in the year 1995, officially apologized for the use of this passage to justify slavery. Other denominations have done similar things in the decades since. Some of them still have not. But the damage that was done in the 4 centuries when the curse of Ham was preached from Christian pulpits as a defense of chattel slavery is beyond calculation. Millions of human beings lived and died under the shadow of a paragraph they never read, cursed by a preacher who had never studied the Hebrew, condemned by a theology that was wrong from the first word. That is one of the millennial consequences of what happened in Noah's tent. It is not the consequence anyone reading Genesis chapter 9 for the first time would predict. It has nothing to do with what Ham actually did. But it is real, and it is why this passage cannot be studied honestly without acknowledging what has been done with it. The other consequences, the ones the Bible itself traces, run through the story of the Canaanites. Because the curse Noah spoke over Canaan was not empty, it ran through the whole of the Old Testament as a shadow behind the story of Israel. Canaan, the 4th son of Ham, settled in the land that would eventually be called Canaan. His descendants included the Sidonians and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites and the Girgashites and the Hivites and the Perizzites. These are the peoples who inhabited the land that God would later promise to Abraham. When Abraham was told to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and travel to a land that God would show him, that land was Canaan. When Abraham arrived, the text notes, almost casually, the Canaanites were already there. For the next 1,000 years, the story of Israel is the story of the Canaanites. Israel comes into the land under Joshua and conquers most of them. Israel intermarries with the ones who remain, in violation of the law. Israel worships their gods. The gods of the Canaanites become the gods of Israel over and over again throughout the entire period of the Judges and the divided kingdom. Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites, becomes the most persistent rival to the God of Israel in the whole Old Testament. The prophets Elijah and Elisha spend their careers fighting Baal worship in Israel. The conquest itself, when it comes, is not a single event. It is a long, brutal campaign that unfolds over decades. Joshua leads the initial invasion across the Jordan River. Jericho falls first, then Ai, then the southern cities, then the northern coalition under the king of Hazor. City after city is destroyed. Population after population is either driven out or killed. The book of Joshua does not soften what happens. It records, with terrible clarity, the fulfillment of what Noah had spoken 1,000 years earlier in a tent after the flood. Every Canaanite king who falls under Joshua's sword is, in the biblical framing, one more note struck by the curse Noah pronounced when he was still dizzy from wine. Some of the Canaanites survive. The Gibeonites trick Joshua into a treaty and become permanent servants of Israel, hewers of wood and drawers of water, in the exact language of Noah's curse. Read the Hebrew of Joshua chapter 9, verse 27. The Gibeonites, Canaanite people, become wood cutters and water carriers for the assembly of Israel and for the altar of the Lord. It is the servant of servants status Noah spoke about, playing out 10 centuries later in a treaty signed under an oak tree at a place called Gilgal. The Jebusites hold Jerusalem itself until the time of King David, who finally conquers the city and makes it the capital of Israel. The Philistines, though sometimes counted separately, occupy the coastal plain and fight Israel for centuries, from the time of Samson through the time of David. And the Phoenicians up north, the seafaring Canaanites of Tyre and Sidon, continue to trade with Israel while quietly influencing its religion in ways the prophets scream about for generations. Every one of these developments has been read by various commentators throughout history as the working out of Noah's curse. From the moment Noah spoke those words in his tent, the branch of Ham that ran through Canaan became a shadow chasing itself across the ancient world. Every empire the Canaanites built, every conquest they suffered, every religious horror they participated in, was traced by some ancient writers back to that one night after the flood. Whether or not you accept that reading, the biblical text itself does trace it. The book of Genesis writes the curse. The book of Joshua describes its fulfillment. And every prophet, from Isaiah to Jeremiah, refers back to the destruction of the Canaanite peoples as a moral event, tied to their own choices and their own worship. And the specific religious practices of the Canaanites were among the darkest in the ancient world. Archaeology has confirmed what the Bible describes. Canaanite religion included ritual prostitution in the temples. It included the practice of sacrificing infants to Molech, an ancient Ammonite and Canaanite deity, by placing them in the arms of a heated bronze statue. Excavations at ancient Canaanite sites have found the remains of infants who were sacrificed. It is one of the most documented cases of child sacrifice in ancient religion. In 1928, a French archaeological team began excavating a coastal site in northern Syria called Ras Shamra. Underneath the sand, they found the ruins of an ancient Canaanite city called Ugarit. Ugarit had been a major trading center in the late Bronze Age, and its scribes had left behind thousands of clay tablets in a language now called Ugaritic. The tablets contained something scholars had never before had access to: the actual religious literature of the Canaanites, their myths, their prayers, their rituals, their theology in their own words. What the Ugaritic tablets revealed was a religious system built around a pantheon led by El, the father god, and Baal, the storm god who fought a cycle of battles against Yam, the sea, and Mot, death. The Baal cycle described how Baal died each year and was resurrected. Worshippers in Canaanite cities participated in this cycle by conducting fertility rituals believed to bring rain and abundance. Sexual acts inside the temples were part of the worship, and in times of crisis, in war, in famine, in drought, human sacrifices were offered to persuade the gods to intervene. The Bible's descriptions of Canaanite religion, which readers for centuries had suspected of exaggerating for polemical reasons, turned out to be, if anything, understated. The Canaanites really did practice what the Bible said they practiced. The archaeology confirms the polemic, and what emerges from the Ugaritic tablets is a picture of a civilization that had built an entire theology around the worst tendencies of the ancient Near Eastern imagination. When the Old Testament describes the Canaanites as under a curse, it is not making an abstract theological claim. It is describing a religious culture that practiced infant sacrifice, temple prostitution, and other rites that horrified even other ancient cultures around them. The Book of Deuteronomy commands the destruction of the Canaanites specifically because of their religious practices. Do not do as they do, the text warns. Do not learn from them. Do not sacrifice your children as they sacrifice theirs. The Canaanite civilization eventually gave rise to the Phoenicians, one of the great trading empires of the ancient Mediterranean. The Phoenicians spread across the Mediterranean, founding trading posts everywhere from Cyprus to Spain. They invented the alphabet that eventually became the ancestor of every Western writing system. Every letter you are reading in an English book, every letter in Greek or Latin or Arabic or Hebrew, descends ultimately from the Phoenician alphabet, which means that the descendants of Canaan, the cursed son, gave the Western world the very tool it uses to read the Bible that curses them. And the Phoenicians founded the city of Carthage, which became one of the largest and most powerful cities in the ancient world. Carthage inherited many of the religious practices of its Canaanite parent culture. The Tophet of Carthage, an ancient sacrificial precinct located just outside the old city walls, has yielded the remains of thousands of infants who were sacrificed to the gods of the city. Excavations at the Tophet have found urns containing the burned bones of children, arranged in layers over centuries of continuous ritual use. It is one of the largest single archaeological witnesses to human sacrifice from any ancient civilization. Carthage was eventually destroyed by Rome in one of the most complete acts of civic annihilation in ancient history. The Roman general Scipio, when the war was over, is said to have wept because he saw in Carthage's fall a prefiguration of what would eventually happen to Rome itself. Every one of these developments has been read by various commentators throughout history as the working out of Noah's curse. From the moment Noah spoke those words in his tent, the branch of Ham that ran through Canaan became a shadow chasing itself across the ancient world. Every empire the Canaanites built, every conquest they suffered, every religious horror they participated in, was traced by some ancient writers back to that one night after the flood. Whether or not you accept that reading, the biblical text itself does trace it. The book of Genesis writes the curse. The book of Joshua describes its fulfillment. And every prophet, from Isaiah to Jeremiah, refers back to the destruction of the Canaanite peoples as a moral event, tied to their own choices and their own worship. So we come back to the tent and to the question we started with: what actually happened? Here is what we can say with reasonable confidence after 2,000 years of scholarship. We do not know. The text does not tell us. It hides the details deliberately, and every theory that has been proposed depends on reading between lines that were left blank on purpose. The best modern scholarly guess, based on the linguistic parallels in Leviticus and the severity of Noah's reaction, is probably that what Ham did was sexual in some form. Whether against his mother or against his father himself, whether an actual physical act or a violation of the family bed in some ritualistic sense, the text seems to point in that direction. The idiom is too specific to be accidental. The rage is too intense to be about mere looking, and the target of the curse, the specific son who represents the consequence, seems to require something more than gossip. But the text refuses to say. It could have named the sin. Every other sin in Genesis is named. Cain's murder is named. The pride of Babel is named. The sins of Sodom are named. The sin of Ham, whatever it was, is left in shadow. And this may be the key to the entire passage, that the shadow is the point. Scholars who have worked on the redaction of Genesis, meaning the way the text was edited and shaped by the ancient scribes who compiled it, have offered several theories about why the passage is so cryptic. One theory is that the original story was much more explicit, and the editors of Genesis chose to soften it because the content was considered too disturbing to be repeated in a book that would be read publicly in synagogue. Another theory is that the story was always ambiguous, and the ambiguity is a literary device meant to force the reader to interpret. A third theory is that the ancient audience already knew what the phrase meant, and the text does not spell it out because there was no need. The listeners understood the euphemism as clearly as they understood any other technical language in Leviticus. Whichever theory you accept, the effect of the ambiguity is the same. It has produced 2,000 years of debate, Every generation has looked at the passage and asked the same question, and every generation has answered it differently. That is not a bug in the text. That may be a feature of the text. The passage is not just describing what Ham did, it is testing the reader. What do you think Ham did? What do you assume when a father is passed out and a son walks in? What do you fill in when the text refuses to say? Because whatever Ham did, and whatever Noah understood him to have done, the shape of the story is about something bigger than the act itself. It is about the fragility of the patriarch, about the shame of the family, about what a son does when he sees his father naked, weak, and vulnerable. It is about what a righteous man becomes when he thinks the world has been made safe for him, about the poison that survived the flood by living in the hearts of the survivors. About the fact that even after God washes the world clean, the first thing his righteous man does is get drunk, and the first thing his son does is turn against him. Noah's tent that night is a mirror. It is not just a story about one man's failure and one son's crime. It is a story about how quickly the new world became the old one, about how the children of the ark, given a clean planet and a fresh start, produced within a single generation a betrayal so ugly that the patriarch had to speak a curse that would echo for 4,000 years. The strangest thing about the story is not the sin that happened inside the tent. The strangest thing is that the sin happened at all. That Noah, the man God saved to be the beginning of humanity's second chance, discovered on the floor of his own tent that human evil had come through the flood with him, that whatever was wrong with the world before the water fell was still wrong after the water drained, that the problem was not out there, the problem was in the house. And there is one final piece of this story that most people never notice. When Noah names his sons in Genesis chapter 9, he does something strange in the middle of the curse. He says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." Not blessed be Shem. Blessed be the God of Shem. And then he says, God will enlarge Japheth, and that Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem. Some early Christian commentators read this as a prophecy about the future, that the God who would eventually be worshipped worldwide would be identified as the God of Shem. That is, the God of the Semitic peoples, the God of Abraham and the God of Israel, and that Japheth, whose descendants would settle Europe and the far reaches of the world, would eventually come to dwell in the tents of Shem, meaning that Gentile peoples would come to worship the same God that Shem's descendants worshipped. It is a strange prophecy for a drunk old man to make right after being humiliated by his own son. But if it is a prophecy, then it has come true. The God worshipped by 2 billion Christians and by 14 million Jews and by 2 billion others in the Abrahamic tradition traces his identity in the biblical text back to Shem. Every Gentile Christian, according to this reading, is a descendant of Japheth who has come to dwell in the tents of Shem. Every believer in the God of the Bible, in every language and every country, is in some sense a fulfillment of the words Noah spoke in the same moment he cursed his grandson. That is the strange arc of the passage. It contains, in 12 verses, the darkest curse in Genesis and one of the most quietly optimistic prophecies in Scripture, side by side, spoken from the same mouth, in the same speech. And it all comes out of one night, in a tent, with a drunk man on the floor and a son who did something the Bible refuses to name. So the question comes back to you. Which of the 5 theories do you find most convincing? Do you think Ham simply looked and mocked and Noah's curse was prophetic? Do you think Ham castrated his father to end his line? Do you think the sin was maternal incest and Canaan is the child produced by it? Do you think it was direct assault on Noah himself? Or do you think it was the theft of the priestly garment, an act of religious rebellion rather than physical violation? Tell me in the comments. Because after 2,000 years of rabbis and theologians and historians and scholars all arguing about this passage, none of them have proven their case. The text is silent for a reason, and the reason may be that we are the ones who are supposed to fill in the silence based on what we know about human nature, about family, and about how the worst things people do to each other are the ones we least want to say out loud. If this film moved something in you, and you want more Bible stories where the deeper truth is hiding underneath what everyone thinks they know, there is another one on your screen right now. It looks at another Old Testament figure whose story has been misread for centuries, and whose real crime turns out to be something almost no one talks about. Watch it next, and subscribe so you do not miss the ones we release every week. I will see you at the next mountain.